It's like all heaven's watching and all hell's against me, but I feel the winds of change.
Hi, it's a great joy to be able to share with you some of the stuff that God's doing in the church in France and what we're learning. Just to introduce myself, I know that I may sound English. That's because my parents are English and I was born in Essex. But we moved to France in 1990 when I was 3 years old, and I grew up in France on the eastern side of Paris. I do still have some relics of British culture, like supporting the mighty Arsenal Football Club instead of PSG, my local club. But in most other ways, I feel more French than English and feel more comfortable in a French cultural setting and ministering into France rather than the UK on the whole. I've been an elder in a church in Paris that used to be a part of New Ground and has since joined Catalyst, and I am now an elder in a church in Paris that we planted with New Ground back in 2018. Life is good. The church is in a really good place and we're starting to see some really exciting fruit here in Paris. So let me describe the faith landscape and the cultural landscape and how this is shaping what God is doing in France and how the church is doing in France. So ever since pretty much the Emperor Constantine, and definitely since King Clovis in 492, France and the established church had extremely close ties, the nation and the state and the church. Some of the great theologians, monks, leaders in the global church either came from France or were based in France at some point, or rather over the long history of my nation. So Irenaeus of Lyon, Peter Abelard, Bernard of Clairvaux, the very first bishop of Paris was a guy called Saint Denis of Paris. He's pretty much always depicted in statues with his head chopped off and his head held in his hand, because legend has it that after he was beheaded for his faith, he walked around with his beheaded head in his hands over a few miles, still preaching the gospel before he breathed his last and fell into his grave. Now, whether this is fact or an apocryphal myth, I'll leave it up to you. But the point is that France has been the hotbed of mighty moves of God and the birthplace of many mighty men of God. When Luther banged his 95 Thesis on a church in Wittenberg, the whole church was ripe for a change, and pretty much half of France did actually receive Luther's Reformation with open arms, and the other half strongly opposed it. So France was known as the eldest daughter of the church, and so the vibrancy of established religion in France meant that the Reformation was both welcomed and opposed with equal vigorous strength. One king around about that period, Henry IV, established a truce in the 16th century. He'd become convinced of the truth of Reformation Christianity, but in order to appease the strongly Catholic Parisian nobility, he decided to remain officially Catholic, but passed laws of religious tolerance. Sadly, the pendulum swung back rapidly. In the 16th and 17th century, King Louis XIV started persecuting Protestants stronger than ever. In the meantime, France had given birth to another great of church history. John Calvin is actually Jean Calvin, born in Noyon, about 100 miles north of Paris. But he was forced to flee during the persecutions, and Reformation Christianity was pushed back and snuffed out effectively. And over the next 250 years, France became both the hotbed of and a major pushback against secularism. France to this day is both the place in which secular modernism stems from, and on a European scale is probably one of the strongest bulwarks against some of the extremes. The French are very anti-woke in many, many places, for example. So France right now is officially neutral religiously in such a way that religious neutrality is almost a religion and a creed in and of itself. And at the same time, many people in France remain strongly attached to Catholic traditions and heritage. The evangelical church was pretty much snuffed out when the first Anabaptists rose up in Western Germany and Eastern France. These were some of the first people that would be considered evangelicals by today's standards, and pretty much they didn't make a return, evangelicals, until the 1950s, when American missionaries or people who were affected by the Welsh revival made their way over to France. The Assemblies of God saw remarkable expansion through a guy called Douglas Scott. He's a guy who could barely speak the language, but he went from town to town in the 1930s, bringing Pentecostalism into France. Interestingly, most of the converts to Pentecostalism came from the Catholic Church. So the Pentecostal Church in France is still recovering from a highly legalistic and hierarchical approach, stronger than in other countries. Evangelical churches have had a hard time getting along. The number of evangelical churches has pretty much multiplied 13-fold since World War II, growing from 50,000 believers to nearly 650,000 today. There's a new evangelical church planted in France every 10 days on average, and most evangelical churches have finally unified within the CNEF, the French Evangelical Alliance, that was only set up 15 years ago. As for Newfrontiers in France, I think first contacts were made in the 1990s as contingents from France went over to Stoneleigh. Some churches joined Newfrontiers, but let's say we've had a bit of a rocky history. My take on it is that the foundation laying phase in France has been long and difficult. It's been 30 years now, and we don't feel like the foundations have ever been super strong. But right now, actually, we are seeing real movement. As New Ground, we've grown from 5 or 6 churches to now up to 20 churches or church plants over the past few years. Churches, church plants, all places we're looking to plant into. We have 3 regional hubs being set up with translocal teams serving each of those. As New Ground, we're sensing that we're able to contribute more widely to the evangelical conversation in France, as there are, in our nation, very few churches that would really be word and spirit in a strong kind of way, and not huge amounts of churches in France that function with apostolic ministry at the heart of what they're doing. And so we're actually finding as New Ground that there are loads of other movements looking in and asking how they can learn from how we function. So it's exciting. We're still very, very small, but we are in some ways in a completely different place from in the UK or in the US or other places where you wouldn't count so much as the margins. We do feel very much like we are marginal on a Newfrontiers scale. We're marginal within the evangelical church in France. So yeah, even though we are in a Western country with a rich heritage in the gospel, France in some ways does still count as the margins. And so the question is, in what way do we feel like God is shaping us in a specific way in this space? And I'd say there are 3 things. One, we're shaped by the militancy of France's religious neutrality. Secondly, we're shaped by being a minority in a wider culture. And third, we're shaped by the specifics of French culture itself. So first point, as I said, France is militantly neutral. Teachers in schools can't say what their religious beliefs are to the kids that they teach. Churches could never use public school facilities or municipal halls for church activities. Some people even oppose us openly on the grounds that religion should remain in the private space and not be spoken about openly, which we'd be passionate to do as evangelicals, missional-minded evangelicals even more so. So this has all sorts of drawbacks and challenges, as you can imagine, but this is how God has shaped us in a positive way, actually, in a way that I feel like churches in France have something to contribute to the wider church conversation. And I'd say this is how. Most Christians in France don't expect the state to help us out in any way. So if we're going to see advance, it all has to come from the church's efforts. This can make us resilient and not entitled. Most Christians in France have no illusion concerning the fact that our nation is a Christian nation. It isn't. Nor should it be. Nor should any nation be. This can help the church in France to think through what it means that believers are strangers in residence on earth. And it means that we're not very susceptible to things like Christian nationalism or any nonsense like that. Our focus remains building the kingdom of God, because to us it's so extremely clear that the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of our God are two very separate things. We embrace the separation of the church and the state because we've seen kind of close up and personal that when the church and the state merge, or when they're kind of get into bed together, it's always at the expense of the purity of the church's autonomous and prophetic witness within the nation. So Bernard of Clairvaux, he's one of our greatest theologians, genuinely one of our greatest theologians, and yet he also, probably against his own conscience, he was one of the people who was used to advocate the state's request for people to go on crusades and to justify it on religious grounds. So the church was instrumentalized by the state, but it couldn't find its way out of this kind of being instrumentalized because it was getting too many benefits from the state. These days we are radically separate from the state, which means that the gospel message doesn't get diluted with questions of national interest. So there is a purity in the message and the culture in our churches, and there's a resiliency against the tides of culture because we are radically separate from the state. Our presidents don't get crowned by archbishops. They don't swear on the Bible as they get instated. That means that the church leaders are free to speak up without fear that they will lose any state-given privileges. We have no state-given privileges. And the Bible doesn't get instrumentalized for political reasons because in France, the Bible basically has no cultural clout. So we are free to speak for ourselves and the Bible is free to speak for itself. This is one of our great upsides, and I personally wouldn't swap it for any cultural clout in the world. It's one of the things that I believe God has used most powerfully to have his will be done in French churches, and probably one of the biggest forces of evil used by the enemy within church institutions in other nations that are linked to their nation states more closely. And I think for us as Newfrontiers, as descendants of Puritan Calvinists on a theological basis, or descendants of Free Church Protestants, or of a house church movement of charismatic radicalism, we as Newfrontiers should be super excited to explore what church lived out without the corrupting influence of national politics could look like and should look like. It does mean, though, that finding buildings, contributing to social change through policy, making a difference to the poor in our neighbourhood is very different and is very challenging and harder, especially so in a nation like France, where the nation itself prides itself at taking care of its poor. But I get envious when I hear of everything, for example, that Jubilee Plus is able to do in the UK, and I hate the way that it doesn't translate into my context. But I still stand by the fact that separation of church and state and separation of religion and state is a net gain for the gospel, because there's nothing less gospel-like than a watered-down gospel. So that's the first point. Second point, our position as a cultural minority. Now this has strengths and weaknesses, as I think that it plays into one or two key themes of the Bible's vision of the church, but it also plays against other themes of the Bible's vision of the church. Less of this large tree in which all of the birds can come and find shelter, or the joy of all nations. But the church in France, by and large, does carry the marks of what the Old Testament prophets called the faithful remnant, or the little flock that Jesus promised to give the kingdom to in Luke 12. These are pictures of the church, and we embody these and get the strength of them. So the idea of a remnant is this: small, different from wider society, resilient because it's become used to speaking up in difference against the conformity of wider culture. We're comfortable with being different, basically. We're comfortable with not being liked. We're comfortable with being uncomfortable. This means that because there's simply zero social benefit in being a committed believer, those who are committed church-going believers are committed church-going believers because they want to be and choose to be from a place of genuine devotion to Jesus, and not a place of respectability or of being seen as a good person or anything else like that. So this is a massive strength. We're kind of weird and we don't care. We've learned to embrace it over a span of more than 100 years. But the downside is that it also makes us, kind of weird, and not in a good way. People in many churches in France are very unaware of how to talk about or express their faith in a way that makes any sense to a newcomer. We're a counterculture for sure, but actually not all expressions of counterculture mean that we're building bridges between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of our world. So when I look at the church in England, I'm often thinking, you're trying too much to be like the culture. And there's sometimes, not enough value given to being distinct from the culture, even in the ways that we do things, the choices that we make in terms of how we do church or how we meet as a church or worship. But when I look at the church in my nation, I'm often thinking we're trying too little to understand and engage with culture in a way that will appeal and bring the gospel to bear on any more than just a small bunch of people who have this predisposition to be slightly social outcasts. So this means that we're also more vulnerable to weird theology, more vulnerable to weird stuff like conspiracy theories on a variety of topics in churches in France in quite a big way. More positively, we're not so likely to be taken in by trends that bring the world into the church. So that's the second point. And so third point, the way in which we in the church in France are shaped by the specifics of French culture. I'll just give one example here, but this is a principle I'm passionate about for all of missiology, actually. Let's look into what there is in a given culture that specifically brings out the glory of the image of God in each and every culture differently, and see how that gives a flavour of the kingdom in a way that is distinct in our culture, different from other cultures, and how that can contribute to the wider body of Christ. But then also see that our emphasis on these cultural specifics that go with our nation's cultural specifics, they need to be checked very carefully, especially when we export our brand of Christianity. So let me give you just one or two examples of this and then apply it to France. So think of Bethel Church in Reading, USA. They're seeing strong impact locally and strong impact globally. But some of us are a bit uncomfortable with the vocabulary, some of the style, the stuff that seems to be influencing the way that they do ministry and the way they talk about God and the gospel and the Spirit. But when you go and look at it close at hand in their context, you see that Reading is right near Shasta Mountain, one of the high places of occult stuff in the US. So these guys are out there in that cultural space trying to make the gospel relevant in that space and probably doing a pretty good job of it. But so they'll speak in a certain way, explain things in a certain way that builds bridges with the people out there who are into that stuff that they're actually ministering to close at hand. But when we in France or England or other places receive what they're saying with all their emphasis on kind of spiritual atmospheres and quite a mystical approach to the things of the Spirit, some vocabulary that's just from a different world, what they're doing is that they're accidentally exporting some new agey kind of stuff into the church that we shouldn't be importing. So powerful and relevant ministry out there can be powerful ministry to us as they export it, but also it can export some stuff that they're only doing and saying because of the cultural space that they're working into and that we shouldn't be importing. Okay, second example, African churches in African countries, countries that have been steeped in animism for years. Now, there are ways to teach the Bible and preach the gospel that makes sense for guys in that nation to build bridges into the culture there and make it relevant and understandable for people that they're speaking to. But when this way of understanding church and the Bible and the gospel, we're speaking about church and the gospel and the Bible, is imported into France, as it is increasingly, in a wonderful way, what it does also do there is that it brings animistic undertones that are impacting the church in France with stuff that isn't actually biblical. Does this make sense? This principle, Contextualization in one culture is powerful, and we all do it and should do it and do it as well as possible. But when our brand of Christianity and our culture is exported, we're sometimes exporting unwittingly cultural strongholds that we're fighting against in our context by ministering the way that we do and by building bridges, but we're exporting that into other cultures, and things that don't exist in those other cultures, we're actually bringing them in whilst trying to fight them on home base. So what does this principle look like in France? Well, in France, one of the key cultural strongholds is intellectualism. We have a history of academia, philosophy, powerful reasoning and ideas that reverberate around the world. There's been a book written about France by Sir Has a Reesing, a British historian, and his book's called How the French Think, an affectionate portrait of an intellectual people. And this sums up so much of the cultural strength of France. And we see this played out in the church in France. We're a small body of people on a global scale, but relative to our size, we have actually exported some very significant theologians relative to the size of the church in France. We don't really have any kind of Christian leadery guys, that have a global impact from France. Nor any Christian preachers that have any global impact from France. Within the evangelical church, for sure, we don't have any social activists that have a global impact coming out of France. But we do have a steady stream of theologians who teach at some of the very best colleges and seminaries in the world. Even within New Ground in France, although we're a tiny family of churches, we have the theological firepower to start our own theological online centre of higher education called the Institut de Théologie Réformée Charismatique, the Institute of Reformed and Charismatic Theology. This is one of the ways that the image of God, reflected in a distinctly French way, is having a big impact, and it is shaping who we are as the body of Christ in France, and as one voice of its own distinct timbre within the chorus of every nation, tribe and tongue, singing the worth and the value and the glory of the Lamb. Now this has implications. It means that this great strength is also a weakness. It means that we need to be aware of this tendency, this leaning as French churches. We need to see that we're the unusual ones. We're the weird ones. We are slightly off kilter on this when we consider what we have to receive from other nations. It means that we need to be aware that this strength of ours also can export something of French Enlightenment thinking, or French postmodern philosophy, or French existentialism, or any other ism that found its roots in France. Now, we've managed to find a way of expressing the gospel that makes it compelling to these secular philosophies. But with that, we've maybe taken on some of the vocabulary, the codes, the mentality of these powerful schools of thought. And we express our Christianity in a way that speaks to this, but speaks with this as well in it. And so it's not so much of a danger as long as it stays in France, because we're building bridges to our culture. But let's be very careful not to export this when we're invited to speak to a more global audience. And I think that applies to any culture. We need to all be aware of this. I may well have been doing some of this to this extent during this episode. So I want to at least acknowledge that. I make you aware of it. This is the place I'm coming from. This is the way I'm speaking. And these are some of the cultural strongholds that I'm speaking into. And I've been shaped also by those unwittingly as I try to bring the gospel into this space. But this is also, saying this is an appeal to people from other nations that are involved in France. Positively, we have to receive from you something of a brand of Christianity that isn't so reliant on intellectual rigor and deep thinking in order to see and savour Jesus. We don't need the intellectual rigor to see and savour Jesus, and we as French need to hear that from people from other nations. But on the other hand, it is also incumbent to you who come over to France to be able to see and value and not denigrate, and or worse still, demonize or view as morally inferior the way in which French Christians express their Christianity in a way that reflects the specifics of our culture. It may mean that we struggle sometimes to connect with some of the aspects of life in the spirit more than other people and other peoples. And we need to learn from the rest of the body and unlearn some of the ways that our culture has formed us. But it does also mean that with the strength that our cultural specifics carry, we have a specific contribution to the work of God in the world through the ways that God has made his image shine forth in a specific way, with a specific hue in this great nation of France. There you go. I hope this was helpful in some way, and I'd just like to end by saying un grand merci de m'avoir écouté et que Dieu vous bénisse.
It's like all heaven's watching and all hell's against me, but I feel the winds of change.